North Dayton. Epilogue. 13 tornadoes hit the Dayton, Ohio area on May 29th, 2019. Daylight. The torn away road top. The unpainted buildings. Double shadow the brown river. A hillside hacked free hangs like bees in a stilled swarm. Birds remove themselves hundreds at a time. And everywhere trees had split, paused in their sudden ballet of falling. You emerged from a roofless house, your face godless in a shock of orphan light. All the power was out. There were only words for us to use. This is from a series, part of a new manuscript called Fatigue Performance. Every poem's called Fatigue Performance. Sort of a post previous election, or I should say the post-Trump, pre-pandemic sort of writing around having a child born in that era and sort of thinking about how do we do this? I mean, we always ask that as a parent, like, how do we do this? But like in the moment of, and I feel like that's more and more the case, like how do we raise a kid today? Sorry. I mean, she knows. Fatigue Performance. Tonight the wind is in your voice and the gods are nervous about the drinking water. Someone hijacks the background with 3 simple dance moves, or maybe the clouds paused on the television set during a ball game. The silence inside a photograph of you eating alone in an old yearbook. This is going to be over before we know it, but not before your hands become small birds in celebration of the present snow. It's like listening to your heartbeat in the club, all the lights out, all by yourself. A face in the crowd and the photograph in my wallet in the city of complete strangers is a reminder of how many times I tried to run away as a child. The night loud with rented darkness. Your eyes, the private color of the animal hour. To make mistakes out of nothing, that's who I am behind closed doors. I go out into the yard and look up. Stars or whatever. They are wherever too. Do one more new poem. No, I say new poem, newish poem. I don't remember when I wrote a lot of these actually. Unknown history. By morning, I learned how to listen. You laughed an entire day out of your body. Tears would come later. When you said the younger you hurt like hair pulled, like far away. We spoke as the season crossed the lake like a scar. So I'm going to read about 7 of these poems, 6 or 7, 7 or 8, 8 or 9. They're really short. They're about sonnet length. And they're all from this book called Exclusions, which Mike mentioned. And all the poems are excluding something, whether it's an idea, an object, a feeling. So they're all titled Poem Excluding Something. Poem excluding fiction. We live in the most fortunate of times, and who's to blame? Our moods like the four seasons in a tinted window overlooking a bank robbery. Everyone is raising children on cable television, on leashes, on the slot machines that have become our elegies. We live other lives in high school, college, on the porch reading the obituaries. Say, I miss you, into the mirror while shaving, brushing teeth, plucking something that's meant to grow forever. Poem excluding war. In those days it rained until countries surrendered. And then for more than a moment there was no war. Soldiers held hands around a campfire and over time began to blush, began to rename their machine guns after flowers. Say something you want to be remembered for. Say the part no one recognizes as song. Poem excluding the metric system. We take each other in like secular holidays, like mountains through binoculars in a televised storm. Here you are, a shit show of everything you've read online. And there's such a revolutionary clumsiness in the way you kissed me goodbye through all of August. The way you navigate the work week with something like a Cold War settling on your eyelashes. Poem excluding taxes. On this day in history, the moon died of natural causes. Astronauts were unavailable for comment. There was a white silence in all the rabbit-shaped clouds. To comfort you, I read a bedtime story where everything died of natural causes. It began, on this day in history, the moon died of natural causes, though we still dreamed it was full. You shrunk beneath the sheets with the most German of smiles. Poem excluding answers. Someone spends her entire life dreaming of how it will end. It makes her sad. We sail a small boat within her heart and discover another heart. Though it looks more like a moon lit from within by a single exploding bottle rocket. Feels like a library in here, which is good. Poem excluding modern technology. You fill the pool with cough syrup and the hot tub with 1,000 hollowed out cicada shells. A man becomes a state bird in the rifle scope of a child. And the trees remember themselves as seedlings. A teenager mistakes his shadow for an old friend. Together they think the unthinkable. You climb a tree and grow your hair shoulder length, We're almost too young. I'm just going to do two more and then sit in that sunlight over there in front of Lindsay. Thanks for the few people who came out, for Mike for putting this on, for recording this, wherever that will go. Go Cavs? Yep, that's the right thing. Everybody's like, yeah, that's right. Poem Excluding Politics. Everyone we know with brown hair, blonde hair, black hair, and strawberries in their mouths on the floor of a silent house in the suburbs. Everyone we know with a goatee, a mohawk, a head shaved as a symbol of surrender. Life is what it feels like when you say, it would be good to see you again, with shifting weather patterns, and children constantly gravitating toward the monkey bars to start another subculture. The sky moving over them like a bodyguard in a low-budget film. Everyone we know gives us a look that says, I'll tell you later. Last poem. Thanks for listening. Poem Excluding Elegy. We peel potatoes in first class in the Idaho of your dream. Near the back of the plane, I wave a flag completely constructed of stars. You wake up in a yawn of turbulence and watch a river 30,000 feet below snake away like jazz. We are flying over the heartland, and the sky waits for God. The rich folks in first class with warm cookies wait for God. And out swell the clouds of interpretation, and we become children in their presence. Point at that one, and that one. Below, the roads go on without us. Like veins, they swell and disappear into fields meant for no one at all. Thanks.
I thought I would read a little bit from this book, The Upstate, that came out last fall, and then move us from the upstate region of South Carolina, which is what this book is about, to the Rocky Mountain West, which is where I was living right before I came to Cleveland, and then finish with a Cleveland poem. So I should say, this is not upstate New York, where Noah is from. This is the upstate of South Carolina. It's the region that's closest to the Blue Ridge Mountains, which is where I lived from 2013, 2014, all the way up to 2018, 2019. And so this book is very much about having a love-hate relationship to a place, and especially about having that relationship to a place in the same year as Noah was writing about, 2016, right after the Trump election, and following. So, planning. Once there was an image of a garden projected on a screen. Once there were orderly hedges and white gravel paths. The garden wasn't planned for getting lost in, but that's what people did there. It was just the garden's outlines, but you could still trace the path. It's not at all like how the straight line of history, now we know, runs out in the depopulated suburbs where the wires run above ground, runs out in strip malls, parking lots of trailers selling pills and armchairs, runs out in a wealth of places of supplies for everything mechanical or animal. Once I couldn't wait a moment longer in Virginia. Once the sun rose red outside a hotel room in the cold New England dawn. I couldn't imagine any other way to sleep I hadn't tried, cocooned inside one form or another. Why doesn't anyone in these poems speak for her own life? Once I wasn't thinking about the running out. Once I wasn't thinking about anyone else's life or mine as such. I imagined my arm extending outside the window in the cold red morning, held there in the cold red like a steeple while the day rushed past. Is this when the poem appears like a crime scene, like a white outline of smoke or breath in a red New England dawn? It's not an allegory in the strictest sense because the made-up part of it is true. Why doesn't anyone here speak for their own life? Once in South Carolina, there was a flood behind the storage units. Once it was believed relief from was a thing in store. In my life, the major errors accumulate behind me as I go. Soon you will be able to read them like a poem. The Upstate. It always was a little like an outpost here. The sun is big behind the smog. You fill out forms and then you die. The red bush looked like it felt to return to life. The dog came back with ticks on her face. Inside you're being all sorts of people. I cleaned so much and the sky was dark. It wasn't cold, but it was damp enough. Have you forgotten what peripherals are? The trees glowed, but it felt like the end of air. I cleaned so hard we could see the outlines. Then I fell asleep and woke up on the porch. When the leaves blew against the windshield, the volume was turned all the way down. If nothing works out, I guess you could just volunteer somewhere. There were animals with bloodied muzzles. The dog barked at all the cows in Virginia. Whatever kills us will be slow and from the inside. A coffee from the Quick Trip full of chemicals. The dry leaves on the floor in the hallway scared me, maybe like love as it curled somewhere deep in the chest. Overlook. This is now the anxiety you never chose. In the mountains, mountain ash, find the verb for how you lost. In the mountains, mountain ash, red berries flashed out in dry brush, find the verb and suffer it with someone else. Find the verb and suffer it, drove through where the paper mill, suffer the election and the anxiety of the fools. In the air, the paper mill released it all into the air. Sunlight tangled in the air and down the mountain. Has anyone checked up on the air? Do you think you got to choose? Does anyone ever get to choose and still end up together? Drove through mountains in the drought, suffer through the verb together. Is this what you didn't choose and what might outlast? So these poems, the next poems, are from a new manuscript that I think is finished, and it is called Middle Slope. And Mike said maybe he wanted to talk about mountains, so I'm happy to talk about mountains. Mountain poppies. Let us talk about what walks the earth now. Next door, the sirens set off dogs who howled, wolf-throated. I didn't really mind. A slash of poppies appeared down by the ditch, like the mark of a claw, a bear, a wolf, some kind of angry monster. Sometimes the air turned cold and low. Technically, we were in the clouds. It was not at all like floating, not at all like flying or like swimming. I was slow and clumsy. Slash of poppies, mallard ducks, a dust puff in the sun, a jumping blue-fanged spider, a trigger, a thread. But from my heart was pulled a cry, pure as a gun. I stole half the title for this next poem from the wonderful poet Jory Graham. So that half is a half called Wanting a Child. She has a poem called Wanting a Child. This is called The Forest / Wanting a Child. One light, weightless. With the leaves down, the ridge shows through the trees, rounded and solid and trustworthy. Up in the mountains, in the forest, the temperatures drop at night. In all states, it's the forest that interests me most. Pine, aspen, the wind up in them working variously. Time there does things like in a fairy tale, pooling overnight and silver in the morning like water. Walking with the dog, we find a dead bird, a chickadee, black and white, and belly up with little claws pulled in. For the dead bird, time has stopped. For most others, it goes on brightly. 3 nights in a row, I watched the sunset from the front window. Failure, failure, failure. Venus and the moon above the wooded ridge. October. Because it will be winter soon, we will all need boyfriends, I heard a girl say once. Soon I'll spend the weekends again indoors, a return to work to which I ought to be devoted rather than recreating in the wilderness of peaks. I ought to learn to body forth the shapes I want, less frightened of the horrible surround. Yesterday, while walking, we, the dog and I, we found a dead bird fallen from the sky. These days, this happens often. Its beak was sharp and black. It had an elegant white neck twisted, its black eyes open into the drying grass. The air was thick with smoke. I'm not injecting melodrama. The sun wasn't setting in the pastel sky, but somewhere behind it, the air was that opaque, a toxic, gorgeous autumn heat. I wanted to do more than to describe it. I wanted to describe it for once, for all, and then to make it go away. The sky's plasticky sheet drops suddenly. The water bird springs back into the sky. How strange it is to want so much what cannot be achieved in life, in any life, let this one alone, let alone these days before the season or the feeling turns its back. Meadowlark. Little lark, I fly loops above your world, which got so small, while of the real world leaders throw coins over their shoulders into a cold fountain for luck. If it fell out like that, then it was what was wanted by a majority of people, or close enough. The L, the chain link linking it, the shape the night makes on the chessboard, strategical, the long winter, the lake levels low. Oh, look, love, the lark, rising from the wooden fence, her shadow flattening across the dry brush in the yard, the pumpkin vines I looped and piled on the galvanized steel bed, the plot now fallow where the meadowlark could still land. To a future. And then I was released to walk on into my own life, crossing the avenue and continuing down the next block and down our street until the street disappeared in the November haze. The outside world was already brown. The black-eyed Susans dried to rattles on their stems. Not a good thing, this, to take such jeweled matters into my own hands, but not the worst thing either. I, the bird flock tossed into the sky, have changed directions on my own. I, the rabbit, fled on frantically from shelter underneath the car. You, if there's a you, the rattle and the flap, the noiselessness of late sun on dry reeds, the rustle of something I can't see in the dead grass. One more poem. This is the Cleveland poem, the Cleveland suburbs poem. It looks like a bunch of pages. There's not very much text on each page, so don't worry. Thanks again, Mike, for this invitation. I'm new-ish to Cleveland. I've been here for about a year and a half, and it's so nice to be welcomed into this beautiful, incredible, amazing space. And we Cleveland are just so lucky to have it, and to have you, Mike, putting this all together. The circle. The road where I lived went in a circle. Inside the road circle was a circle of grass. Inside the circle of grass was the matter I looked through and looked at, waiting for whatever moved in from the edges and came together in the middle of the circle. It was already summer in the circle when it started. Groups of children played often in the grass, turning their backs and forths quickly, goalpost to goalpost, but in no lines at all of them running across the circle away from me. I met others who lived on the circle. How long have you lived on the circle? They asked. People lived on the circle until old age. I was new, although summer was advanced. The ferns on the circle's edge wilted a little in the heat. One morning, 2 small deer slept beside a mother deer, in the grass next to the white soccer net's white frame in the circle. Their breath made a circle. I could see it from across the street. The dog shoved her head under my hand so I could scratch the warm skull under her fur. Outside, the sun began setting a little earlier, but the children continued. Circles, a pond, a lake encircling all its water. A horizon would be if you could see it all. A stone you skip with its rounded edges out into the lake. A chickadee's chest if the morning is cold. Acorns. One day, a buck deer walked through the circle, through a pile of dead leaves in the circle. When he lowered his head, his big antlers caught the sun. I mean, they glinted. I also mean they appeared for a second to have speared it. Then the sun was released. What would happen in the circle? I asked myself most days. Once the technician showed me a baby growing inside a circle inside me. Then it was not. Every diagnosis after was a circle. The leaves went down, and the early moon came up above the street that made the circle's tangent. The moon, a circle, was so big it would not be photographed. Finally, the sun went down on the other side of the circle, behind the trees without any leaves, leaving the circle empty except for the sound of the children shrieking like gulls over a very far sea. Thank you.
We'll talk about your individual books in a little bit. I do want to ask Lindsay how you got into translation, which is to me more esoteric than getting into poetry, like that. If that makes sense, how did you get into that?
Yeah, another kind of non-straightforward path. And a little bit accidental. So after college, I graduated with a degree in English. Did not know what I was going to do or wanted to do. The French government has this amazing program where they will pay English speakers to go work in a high school for you earn really not very much money at all, but you work something like 20 hours a week or less. Teaching English conversation classes to French kids, so you're basically trying to get them to speak English. You're supposed to pretend that you don't know French. You're just up there like, I don't say it in English, please. I did that for a year in a small town in France. I liked living in France, but I went a little crazy in the little small town. I moved to Paris and did the same thing at the university level. Fell in love with the city of Paris, as one does. Went back every year. I worked for NYU's Summer in Paris program. I made some friends. I was reading a little bit of poetry in French, and always liked the idea of translating, but I didn't kind of know where to start. And then I was reviewing an anthology of conceptual writing by women, and in it there was a poem by a Franco-Japanese poet named Ryoko Sakaguchi. And I loved that poem, and I thought, I wonder what else there is of hers, and whether there is a book that has not been translated, and there was, a little book of prose poems. And so it started with a really concrete project. That book kind of crossed my path, and I started I did it all backwards. Like, I started translating it, I finished the book, I pitched the book to 17 different presses before I found a press that would publish it. And that was how I started translating. So it's not what I recommend for any like potential translators out there. You're supposed to find a home for the book before you translate it, but I didn't know that. It was a book called Adagio ma non troppo, an Italian title, a little book of prose poems that Les Figues Press published in 2017. So I started translating a lot later than I was writing poetry. Yeah.
Let's see. I read this morning Joy Williams reviewed the new Kafka story collection, and she does end it with somewhat critically, but I'm not being critical here. I'm just paraphrasing Joy Williams. But she mentioned that a translator thinks in terms of solutions, a cage in search of a bird. But she means that a little bit critically to the translator. Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, that's so interesting. Let me just say that if Joy Williams is out there listening, I adore Joy Williams. But I think that that is not how I approach translation. It is every when you're translating, and I've said this before, every solution is kind of a bad solution. You're not a cage. You're the opposite of a cage. You're like a little hand trying to like hold out to the bird to maybe get the bird to land on it, and then the bird can fly away again. In other words, when you translate, or when I translate, I am constantly aware of the fact that every choice is a bad choice. Every choice, even if it captures or retains something, it also loses something. And so being a translator is coming to terms, I think, with the fact that things are always lost, but at the same time trying to create something in the new language that is not a cage, but maybe a whole different bird or something, to take that metaphor and really mangle it.
That's good.
Yeah, and I think that's what she suggested. That's what she would have preferred. Excellent. So now we've started a beef with Joy Williams, which I've actually always wanted to do. So, so Noah, so you're starting a book with all the poems being titled the same, and Exclusions sort of has the same sort of projectness to it. Can you talk a little bit about finding these projects and sort of tackling poetry in that way, where everything is so maybe focused?
Yeah, I mean, I think my process is very much like a collector's process, I think. Like, I fill up notebooks with imagery or things that I'm attracted to, things I see, and then if I write that down or write a sort of similar image down multiple times, which tends to happen frequently, then I know there's some sort of seed there, seed in the mind, seed in the world, and I try to unpack that on the page in terms of like the projectness of it, which I don't know. Yes, it is a project, but like I don't know if I fit into the project mold. Like, it's still just like a book of poems exploring a variety of different themes. But I tend to work in like a single Google Doc, and just like every other day I try to get to another page. So it's like, okay, let's fill up 100 pages of a Google Doc. And I think, I don't know if that's helpful or not, but there's a comfort in sort of the form of like returning to something that I'm trying to build out, if that makes sense. So that's sort of where the project or the framework comes out of, if that makes sense.
Do you have any questions? Well, let me know if you do. See, similar to the Google Doc thing, and I was thinking about this when I was reading Lindsay's poetry. There's so many bird names and plant names, and I actually just write down bird names. I've done this for 10 years now because I think they're usually like the most beautifully constructed words in any language. That's just an aside that I have no question regarding. But so Noah, you're literary director at Just Buffalo. Can you talk a little bit about what you do there, Just Buffalo generally, and then maybe how teaching at the public level, if you will, has sort of affected your poetry?
So yeah, I moved to Buffalo in 2012 and was the education director at Just Buffalo, which is a nonprofit literary arts space that's been around since 1975, that has a number of different sort of programmatic, jobs for the community. So we present literary, sort of like this. We put on readings. We have the sort of poets or writers in the school model, and then we have an after-school writing center for teenagers. And then we have a big series called Babel, which brings in sort of, the not just fiction writers, but mostly fiction writers of our time, Toni Morrison, Ta-Nehisi Coates, the people we'll be reading 100 years from now. And the literary director position sort of coming out of, I was working as education director, which was sort of overseeing teaching artists going into schools, programming the writing center where we invite different writers from the community in to teach young writers non-traditional forms of writing, creative writing, stuff that they're not getting in the classroom. And the literary director was sort of I don't know if you call it a promotion, it was sort of like a lateral job title, but it wasn't there before because it was sort of like, because I was also curating readings, the Silo City reading series I started, and this other reading series that we're calling Just Buffalo Presents, where it's, giving space for poets to be poets. We need more things like this on a more regular basis, definitely in Buffalo. There's a ton of poets in Buffalo, and they need outlets outside of just open mics, which those are also necessary, but like places where we can have conversations about your work and people can buy the book. So it's like a blend of that and also just having conversations about literary arts with other community organizations, partnering with the library, partnering with the schools, just creating new partnerships so that like literary arts can be on the table when things are being discussed, because it's often the literary arts are the most underfunded, underappreciated, often art form that exists. And so we're trying to sort of constantly like make the case for why it's important to read, why it's important to have space for poems, why it's important to have these readings. So, and then the second, that was a chunk, but like the second part was like sort of how my public teaching in public schools. So I was teaching in Dayton, taught in Dayton 4th and 5th grade for about 10 years, and teaching a lot of at-risk students, at-risk reading, kids who were struggling readers for many years. And I found the poetry, short form poetry, William Carlos Williams. I was using a lot of William Carlos Williams at the time. I remember was unintimidating, like sort of just looking at it on the page. There's a part of like looking at a poem and it feeling accessible, and you're not looking at the entire novel and having to answer there's a correct answer to knowing what this is, even though there may be. But I think for kids who are struggling with reading, that really jolted me, and made me think about how things look on a page to people who don't necessarily understand reading, and it sort of shifted my thinking a lot. And it's been an ongoing thing I think about, just sort of the accessibility, and accessibility can also be thought of as like a dirty word in literary arts for a number of reasons, but I've always thought that poetry should be a public art form, and it should be for people, the people who are the valet people who are parking the cars, to the people cleaning the hotels, to, everybody here. And I think it's always been this, at least I've thought of it as always like an elevated art form, where you have to have sort of an advanced degree to participate in the culture of it. But I also think the poems that do the most work are the ones that everybody can sort of feel and participate in. And so that's to say, like, the public education part of me is like, how can we create space for poems that are doing that for just the general public? Because I think if the general public can participate in poetry more frequently, then we're going to be living in a better world.
And then Lindsay, teaching at the college level is a little bit different. Has that affected your writing at all?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I feel like in many ways, my answer to that is sort of the same as Noah's. Poetry comes with a lot of baggage, and college students especially, by the time they get to college, it's heartening and not surprising to hear that younger students can find poetry unintimidating. But I think many students, by the time they get to college, they are aware of the cultural baggage that comes with poetry, and so they will say, even graduate students sometimes will say things like, "Well, I'm really nervous around poetry. I don't understand it. There's too much. I don't get the hidden meaning. I don't know what the symbol is." And I do a lot of demystifying. I do a lot of, know that there's a blackbird in this poem and it's a real blackbird, to go back to the names of birds. I think on some level poetry is accessible because we all have senses, and poetry comes from the world of the senses and comes from the world of real things, and real kinds of birds and real, types of plants and trees that are around us. And so for me, that's one of the things I try to teach. Yes, I also try to teach the tradition of poetry, because I think that a poem is richer when you know what who the poet is riffing on or who they're building on. But all of that is none of that is necessary. And I think so when I sit down to write, if I try not to get sort of too much in my own head about it, and to go back to my notes, or to my body or to my senses, and to keep things less cerebral and more physical, I guess is the answer to that. Yeah.
It's related to Just Buffalo and here literary Cleveland. I'm not even particularly that old, but I never had stuff like that when I was young. Like, I was never introduced to creative writing or reading some of the poets that people are reading now at these ages is so crazy to me. Like, so many people check out the James Tate books here. It's crazy. So cool. Yeah. All right. Let's see. So, Lindsay, I did want to just bring up mountains. Just a thing I like to do. So you've lived in the Appalachian area and whatnot. You said out west as well, right? Coming to Ohio, letdown, disappointment. Do you hike out here?
Things I will not say in front of a record. No. I do miss the mountains a lot. This is the first time in a long time that I've lived somewhere where there are not mountains on the horizon, and I miss it. One thing that I've been doing, and I read the other night at the Shaker Lakes Nature Center, and a sort of said a version of this, but one thing that poetry is helping me do, and that feels all the more urgent, I think, because I need to write, is that I'm sort of learning to look differently, and learning to look down, learning to look at the trees, learning to go back to the birds. Like last year, I kind of stumbled into the bird migration that happens. Does this happen in Buffalo too? There's like suddenly there were just all like many blackbirds and goldfinches, and just I think it was the birds migrate through sometime around this time of year. and I live in Shaker Heights, and so there are many, like as I read in the circle, there are many deer. There are these beautiful, beautiful old forested areas. So it's a more a little bit of a tamer kind of nature. Also because I have a baby, I've been spending a lot of time just walking in circles and watching the spring arrive. And so not at all a letdown, just a different kind of a different orientation towards the world, and one that I'm learning how to write about, and it feels like a nice thing.
When I was in Washington, I was hiking in the Olympics casually, and there was a family from Cincinnati that was also there, but apparently they had moved when they were like 20 to Washington, and they absolutely cackled at me and said, "You don't have this there, do you?" And they were just so vicious about it. I just remember them being. Yeah, there's some sort of possessiveness, or yeah, it's crazy. So related to that, can you sort of talk about the Upstate, your sort of vision of Appalachia, the world you've created in your book? There are the birds, the flowers, but then there's always this destruction that's permeating throughout. Can you talk a little bit about your?
Yeah, so I don't think I said this before. I grew up in Northeast Tennessee, so sort of on the other side of the Blue Ridge from upstate South Carolina, and I spent a lot of time going up into the mountains, like when I was a kid, hiking with my family, and then just when I was living in Greenville, South Carolina, also going up. The highest point in South Carolina is not that high, but it was pretty close, maybe a 40-minute drive. It's about, I think it was some like 3,800 feet, so, a nice little climb. And one thing that was happening when I was there was that they were building a kind of like lookout tower on the top of the mountain and like refinishing the road so that you could drive up it. And so when this is sort of right as I was leaving, but that feels kind of like a moment that encapsulates, I guess, a lot of what the book is about, which is watching a place change. The South is such an interesting place. I think someone just sent me a New York Times article about people moving to the upstate region of South Carolina. The economy is doing quite well there, in part because of some labor laws that are questionable, to use a euphemism. And so there's a section in the book called Spells and Charms in which I write kind of these poems that attempt, even though I know it's impossible, to kind of preserve the place or protect it from, like there was always, even when I was growing up as a kid, there was always new construction. That was just something that I grew up with, and it wasn't until I moved to like an older suburb where I was like, oh, this is not everywhere that there are new houses going up all the time, and that all the pastures are becoming subdivisions. Like this is I thought that was just like the way of the world. But at the same time, I think the South is changing. There are more people coming in. The demographics are changing. The age, there are more young people moving. There's a lot of new political energy that is necessary and good. And so it's a hard thing, I think, to be in the position of observing change, feeling powerless in the face of change, knowing that change is a kind of mixed bag. That the development that is kind of good socially is also destructive environmentally. So I should also say that the book begins with an epigraph from the poet C.D. Wright, and the epigraph is, "It was not regional, it was systemic." And so the other thing that I'm trying to do in the book is work against, against the idea that Appalachia is somehow, it's a uniquely backward and strange place. Although it's a unique place for sure. But the forces of kind of change and development that are affecting Appalachia are also, affecting the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And it's impossible to separate off one little region of the country and say, this place is particularly, or this place is kind of, the things that are happening in this place are happening in isolation because they're not. So.
And Noah, in Exclusions, you sort of lay out, well, it's dedicated in part to the people of the Rust Belt. And you do portray a type of Rust Belt that sort of subverts some of the other poetry some may have read, where you're dealing specifically with people and relationships in these areas. Can you just talk about your vision of the Midwest, the Rust Belt?
My vision of the Rust Belt. I mean, I think, growing up in Dayton and thinking about the idea of the flyover state or the flyover states, right, and the larger idea of just being left out. And I think there's this combination of the initial thinking around exclusions was sort of a tongue-in-cheekness of poetry is left out, is excluded itself. Like poems are excluded from, like we were saying earlier, poems are excluded from everyday life often. And the Rust Belt equally is sort of left out of the conversation of, often, again, like the New York City, the LAs, the Denvers, like, it's not a big space. But at the same time, the population is here. And there's cultural things happening and people doing great things. So I think it's sort of, it's an homage to all the people who have sort of helped me become who I became, and also the people who are staying here and doing the work. And I think that's the vision, like how do we continue that in Buffalo? Because Buffalo is very similar in a lot of ways, where it's like a working class town, industry left, and it's really had a long, tough road to become where it is. And a lot of people say there's a renaissance happening there, but there's a lot of racial, socioeconomic issues that are just dividing. As again, it's not just Buffalo that's happening. It's happening across the country. But it's like when you see that and you raise a family in those places and you see people struggling with that every day. Again, it sort of goes back to like, what are the things we can do as a city, as a people, to sort of make this more tenable and more loving, really, because I think that's the root. It's like, how do we love each other more? Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Excellent. So, is there anything else? No. So I think we can end it there. Thank you so much for coming out and reading poems for us. That was a good conversation as well. And thanks, Catherine, for recording this. Anything else you want to say before we go? All right, excellent. I think we're all set then. Thank you.